Drug control laws. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 was something that was put into place in response to 1960s drug culture. People who we now refer to as being in the silent majority, the people who weren't hippies, who were still pretty conservative, who weren't on board with a lot of the young progressive pushes, were not super happy with the drug consumption that came along with it. They attributed a lot of societal problems, things that they perceived as problems like increased single motherhood. They would see like some of the permanent effects like LSD flashbacks, which are pretty detrimental to somebody's psychological well-being going forward, problems with physiological addiction, and decided that these things needed to be reined in. In the 60s and in the 50s, these things weren't illegal. Like there weren't many actually illegal drugs at the time. There were some state laws that prohibited certain ones. There was certainly a lot of social frowning on using a lot of these, where if you were using drugs, you were expected to kind of keep it secret from like, you know, your parents and your job and stuff. And this kind of came a lot really out in the open in the 60s, but it wasn't illegal. People would be, if people went to jail for drug related stuff in the 60s, it would generally be for their behavior while on drugs, like, you know, lewdness or disturbing the peace or something like that. So in 1970, Congress put into place what's called the Controlled Substances Act in response to this drug culture. It created schedules of drugs. So when you hear stuff like Schedule 1, Schedule 2 types of drugs, this is what we're referring to. It basically classifies different drugs based on their perceived severity for psychological addiction, for physiological addiction, for the behavioral changes that it creates in a person that could cause damage in society. And that's how it's classified. It was written in a fairly open-ended way that allowed for new drugs to be added without further legislature. So if you had a derivative of a drug come out, it would automatically be included in the Controlled Substances Act. If you have a brand new class of drug that's never been addressed before that creates similar types of dependence or behavioral disturbances as stuff already on the Controlled Substances Act, it kind of automatically gets to be lumped in with these. It also regulates and tracks companies that make drugs and that make substances that are ingredients for drugs. This has some real benefits to it, right? So it tracks companies that make opioids so that when there's an opioid epidemic, you can figure out who's causing this supply. And then also it regulates and tracks companies that make ingredients for drugs. So pseudoephedrine and cough syrup. Who's making pseudoephedrine? That is what people were can extract to create methamphetamine, to help create methamphetamine. It's a key ingredient. So you would go to the store and you would buy up like a ton of cold and flu medicine that had pseudoephedrine in it, and you would extract the pseudoephedrine. Who's making the pseudoephedrine, and how can we put pressure on these companies to more tightly regulate themselves to limit the supply for illicit use? Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4, and Schedule 5 are your different schedules, your classifications of drugs in decreasing levels of severity, basically. How concerned is society with people's usage of these drugs? Schedule 1 is the most concerned, Schedule 5 is the least. Schedule 1 drugs are drugs that are considered to have a very high risk for abuse, very high risk for addiction, and has no accepted medical use whatsoever. So heroin, there's no actual medical use for that anymore. LSD, ecstasy, you guys call it Molly now. The textbook that I base this off of still calls it ecstasy. I still do by default because that's what it was called when I was a teenager. These don't have any real accepted current medical use, so they get to be put in Schedule 1. Marijuana gets placed into Schedule 1 because it has no actual accepted medical use, but problematically, Schedule 1 drugs can't then be studied for medical use. Things that are classified as Schedule 1, if you would want to use it in a medical context, you would need to do experiments on it, and you would need to do experiments with it on not just animals, but with people, or at least derive data from people who are already using these things, and you're not allowed to do that. So it's sort of a self-prohibiting category, right? Like it's in this category because there's no medical use, but you can't come up with a medical use because it's a Schedule 1. Marijuana is classified in Schedule 1 for a litany of reasons. It was extremely popular in the 60s, and so when these schedules were originally contrived, its popularity, frankly, helped push it into Schedule 1. There's also some pretty racist reasons why marijuana was placed into Schedule 1. It was, prior to that, also pretty frowned upon because it was associated with Mexicans. It's a plant that likes to grow in the type of climate that you have in Mexico, and since it can be grown there and it is a drug, people like to consume it. It was associated with Mexicans, and in some particularly harsh Hispanic blowback that we had in like the 30s and 40s, and then lingered to some extent after it had this permanently like kind of tarnished reputation, even by people who didn't know that it was sort of originally damned because of its association with Mexicans in the United States. Schedule 2 drugs have a really high risk for abuse and dependence, but have a medical use. So like cocaine, for example, we've already talked about, has an actual medical use. So, but it is extremely addictive, so it gets put into Schedule 2. Narcotics are basically all there. Stuff like oxycodone, fentanyl, stuff like that fall into this category. Morphine is in there because it has a medical use. Other types of medical pain relievers or anti-anxiety drugs or barbiturates or whatever that people like to abuse fall in here. So Dilaudid, Demerol, Percocet, fentanyl, codeine in concentrations that are greater than what you would find like in cough syrup are all Schedule 2. Schedule 3 drugs have some potential for abuse, but they have also an accepted medical use. So anabolic steroids, you have real good reasons for prescribing them, and prescribing them isn't necessarily going to lead a person to want to abuse them, but you could, and pretty easily. There are really compelling reasons why somebody might want to abuse these. So anabolic steroids, growth hormones, barbiturates fall into here too. Some opioids that are specifically used for addiction therapy, so like methadone and similar methadone-like drugs, fall into Schedule 3. So you can't buy methadone over the counter. You do need a prescription, but there are like dispensing locations for methadone. Cough syrup and codeine at the over-the-counter concentration are Schedule 3 drugs. Schedule 4 are drugs with a low potential for abuse. I mean, they can be abused, but there's not much potential for it. It's kind of hard to. So, and also have an accepted medical use. So you have drugs like Xanax, that is a kind of super light anti-anxiety drug, and commonly now also has anti-tampering chemicals in there to keep you from being able to consume too much of it and have any effect. Valium is in there. Schedule 5 is kind of everything else. You're not going to abuse it, not in any kind of way. Like it doesn't have enough of a benefit that people would theoretically want to abuse it, and it has an accepted medical use. Cough syrup with very tiny amounts of codeine fall into here. Pseudoephedrine, which is like a stimulant and prescribed currently sometimes as a weight loss drug, falls into there. Pseudoepinephrine, which you would find in other kinds of preparations, is found in there in Schedule 5 too. If you have somebody who's like abusing cough syrup, who's making like purple drink or something, or chugging cough syrup for its effects, are generally not consuming the types of cough syrups that fall into Schedule 5. They're consuming like Schedule 3 level cough syrup.